on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. I've been looking forward to speaking with my next guest for a long time. He's been a hero of mine as a writer and as a public figure for, dare I say it, going on 50 years. And I've read his works many times over the years and followed his peregrinations, some of which were politically forced upon him. Ariel Dorfman is, and that's spelled if you want to look up his website, Ariel Dorfman. Ariel Dorfman is an Argentinian, Chilean, and a North American novelist, playwright, essayist, academic, and human rights activist. His book, the first book I read from him nearly 50 years ago, How to Read Donald Duck, we may talk about that a little bit, had a big influence on me, my own writing, and I also knew about his work in the Allende government in Chile, and in addition to that, have followed him through the years through such works as the play Death and the Maiden, which was made into a film by Roman Polanski. But without any further ado, because I know his time is limited, Ariel Dorfman, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Richard, so much for that very modest introduction. So thank you so much. I'm glad. I hope that, Rex said we should wish for a country that has no heroes. So whatever heroic deeds I have accomplished, they are in spite of myself.
Yeah, the people are supposed to be the heroes, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, we're here, Ariel Dorfman, to talk about your new book, which is, if you all are watching this on video on Free Speech TV or YouTube, the book is in my hand. It is called The Compensation Bureau. And Ariel, if I may, I could summarize it. I have read it.
Please do it. I've summarized it so often that I'd rather have somebody else do it.
I'm so nervous when I do that with a writer. But basically, I would say it is a fable about the fate of humanity, and it sets up that conversation by creating the notion of a cosmic compensation bureau and an actuary with a capital A within that bureau who wants to right the wrongs that have been done to so many human beings who have died before their time, and undertakes a project to allow them to live out their lives in another dimension, which has all sorts of moral implications as well as all sorts of job performance implications for the actuary involved. How'd I do?
You did fine. There's one thing you forgot, and it is that he falls in love with one of the people he's supposed to save. He's not supposed to do this, so he goes 100 times over and over, recreating her life, always in a different way. And of course, they catch him, and we find out not only did they catch him, but this was part of a different cosmic, rather perverse and interesting plan that somebody else has got for him, for the world, and for those for humanity itself, right? So it's a sort of sci-fi fable. You're absolutely right about that, and it deals with apocalypse basically. As what he's trying to do is, this actuary, among other actuaries, is trying to right the wrongs, and to find, because there's a glitch in the DNA, human DNA, where people are warring with each other, and the cruelty we've had. So I'm really asking myself, well, what do you do? How do you compensate? How do you, in some sense, we would ask the question is, how do you atone for this? In other words, how do we atone for the dead, really? How do we look back at the past and see so many people who have died, the slaves and the women who have been rejected, and I mean, just the children, all the terrible things that we've done to one another? Is there a way of compensating that in some way? And this is a sort of a fantastical solution, but it has its problems as well. It will create a series of problems, right? As well as otherwise, there's no plot. But it's my first sci-fi book, if you could call it sci-fi, because these are guardian angels who are somewhere in the cosmos doing these things. But thank you so much. I did want to mention that love story because it is a love story.
Yeah, I didn't know how far to go into the plot points themselves. I left that to you. But, the love story was interesting to me, Ariel, because it raised the question. Okay, obviously this is a moral conversation, right? That we're indulging in by writing or reading this book that says, as you just said, how do we right the countless wrongs, the countless lives unfairly terminated, and so on. The standard answer that most of us would give is by channeling the power of love, right? In some way, collective love, social empathy, all these things that most of us believe in deeply. But there's a danger there too, right? And that's what I took from the love story, is that love can turn the object of your love into a fetish object, into an obsession,
You're absolutely right. He starts out with this enormous compassion, right? But of course, he's a voyeur, right? I mean, he has control over these lives, and so he's looking. And if you look at my plays and my novels, you'll see that the voyeurism is always there, in the sense of I'm always asking myself, well, let's take, for instance, just the example of, you see horrible human rights being violated in the country. Do you intervene in that country? You see somebody being beaten on the street. Do you intervene there? I mean, the problem of intervention, the problem of the inequality of power between the people who want to intervene and those who are victims, let's say, and the idea of victimhood in general is something we have to think about. What I'm trying to do is complicate that, because the easy solutions are, let's just invade, right? Let's just take this person, like Pygmalion, right? I mean, Professor Higgins grabs this maid from this woman from the gutter, right, and turns her into a princess. But it turns out that the princess has got her own agenda, right? And there are subtle things that happen in that sense. And I think that what writing does, or at least fiction does in that sense, and essays as well, is to complicate and ask us questions that otherwise we would not ask. Because the easy answers are always wrong. They're always wrong. Even the easy revolutionary answers are wrong, right?
It has to do with
that.
I'm sorry, please go on.
No. I was just saying, that this is part of the idea that we look at ourselves as well as pointing the finger at what is wrong in the world. And that's part of the compassionate imagination that I try to create. But I don't let my characters off the hook, as I don't let myself off the hook in my own memoirs, right? I'm trying to tell as much of the truth as is possible in a time when we are really, the truth is under terrible pressure, because it's being destroyed everywhere we look. And the erosion of democracy, the erosion of tolerance is great. But at the same time, as writers, we need to ask these very difficult questions. And I think they're pleasurable. There's an enormous enjoyment in asking questions which are difficult, which aren't easy. It's part of the mystery of art, right?
And I feel, as you're speaking, Ariel Dorfman, that there's also part of the pleasure here is just simply like of a child digging in the dirt. The more you dig, the more you're going to find something that to you is a treasure, right? That if you're a child, you find a snail or whatever, and a bottle cap, and in this case, of course, there are much more serious things you might find digging, as in, what you were just describing. Might be what aspect of that is the law of unintended consequences, right? We think we can go in and be the heroes, but what happens if we try?
The idea that there is a savior out there, especially in American culture, there's the idea of this savior who will come in, this superhero will come in and right the wrongs and put everything okay, which of course takes agency and strength away from the possibility of people themselves solving these questions. Now, this novel goes even deeper, because it begins to ask, some of the victims, in typical, I think there's a lot of fun in the novel as well, in the sense that it's a bureaucracy, and it has all the problems of a bureaucracy. So at the end of your session, let's say you died, okay, unjustly, you're handed a questionnaire which you ask, well, how was it? How was the experience? Did you like it? Is there anything you would like to change? And lots of the victims say yes, but what about the people who killed us? What are the people who tortured us? What are the people who starved us? What happens with them? So they set up a Lazarus project. Next to the Lazarus project, they set up the Sisyphus project, which is a project where they take the violators of human rights and they subject them to, because they don't believe in the death penalty, they're already dead, right? They subject them to the same sort of process, which is they have to live through from inside the victims themselves what that victim lived through. So there's a sense of what do you do with the perpetrators, right? I mean, if like me, you don't believe in the death penalty, what do we do with the Hitlers and the Pinochets and the Trumps, right? What do we do with them, right? With those horrible people who have committed such terrible crimes and have created so much pain. What do you do with them? It's a very major question, right? And this book supposedly answers the question. But of course, the question is, what do you do with a feudal lord who has starved his peasants, but at the same time freed some monks or taking care of some poor people, some orphans were there? The idea that this is a gray zone, as Primo Levi would call it, is an important one, right? And so once again, I complicate things as part of the narrative, right? And I don't want to give away more of the plot, right? But there are boxes inside boxes in relation to this.
And I don't want to give away the plot either, but I did want to read at least one paragraph. It appears toward the end, and again, I'm talking with author Ariel Dorfman about his new novel, The Compensation Bureau. I loved the ending. I will not discuss what it is.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. But let's see if this is the one nope, that's not it either. I'm going to read this. Okay, here's the line I wanted to read to you. Yes. One of the characters in the book says, unfinished stories. That's how the paragraph begins. We don't like them. Not you, not me, not any of us. We can't rest until they have somehow been completed. Terrible if they are left there, abandoned, unmoored. Nobody can say we haven't tried. Too much, maybe. I mean, isn't every story an unfinished story?
Yes, of course. But there are two aspects to this. One is there are the unfinished stories of all those people who never were able to tell their stories, in the sense that they never were able to complete them. They were unable to speak. They were silenced, right? They were neglected. You know, when we look back at humanity, it is a history of the silencing of millions and millions of people, right? And of course, it's a silencing of the dead themselves, right, who can't speak. And I constantly try to make the dead speak or allow them a space where they can speak. It's one of my obsessions. So that's one of the forms. In the other sense, right, every story should be unfinished because the reader has to finish it, because others need to continue the story, because I believe in ambiguity. So you want to leave stories open, right? Umberto Eco used to speak about the open story, the idea that the ending should always be ambiguous enough so that we can interpret it in different ways. And lately, with my wife, who is the treasure of my life, really, you know, I'm married for 56 years, almost 57 years now. Every night I read to her, and we're reading we're reading Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and George Eliot and all sorts of wonderful the women of Troy. And the point about this is that when we're rereading the classics that we read a long time ago, we see them in an entirely different light. So we are completing them in a different way. And every reader completes the work of every author. It's a very humbling experience to think that, for instance, what you see in this may not be what I saw. And that's wonderful. In fact, I would even say one of the definitions of art is that the more interpretations you have of one piece, the better that piece finally is. Because the more it can grow, the more it can persist, the more it can enter into a dialogue with others. So it's not complete ever in that sense, right? But of course, these people are obsessed with power. The actuaries and the guardians and all that. They want everything nice and round, right? Because they're very disturbed by anything that doesn't go right. Like people in power in general, they want total control. So there is that ambiguity also about the fact that I think they're wonderful angels, let's say, right? But at the same time, of course, they will begin to find out that they have imperfections themselves. And it's part of the story is that how they discover those imperfections. For instance, there's a character, woman, who is obsessed with sensuality and sex, because these angels, of course, have had no sex, right? That's one of the things that angels, but she's obsessed with it, right? And so one of the narrators asks, why is she always worried about this thing? Why is she speaking about how I dealt with the fact that the woman I love was making love to the husband, right? So I just think it's a very interesting situation to explore. And it began as a tiny, tiny short story, and then it just blossomed, right?
And, you mentioned a minute ago this notion of completion. And earlier you mentioned Bertolt Brecht. And I wonder, to a certain extent, I was thinking about, I could never pronounce the German word, but his concept of leaving an audience, in his case, or readers, disaffected. So
Yes.
so that you don't provide the satisfying resolution as a writer or a playwright, they have to go out and provide I'm probably mangling the concept a bit, but
No. It is. I mean,
it gets called the V effect.
He wants to provoke people. He wants them to be active rather than passive. Now, if you look at Brecht, however, you will see that he affects people very, very deeply. It's the humanity of the characters that he portrays, that he puts on stage, and his poems, which are extraordinary stories about, exile, and he's very ironic, right? I'm Brechtian to the point that I would like to provoke my readers, but I'm not Brechtian in the sense that I believe one must engage fully with them and allow them into that world of compassion as well, right? I mean, even if they don't become active, let's say, right? But our time is limited, and I know you wanted to speak about some other things. So
I do. And in fact, I'm going to make the transition in this way, Ariel Dorfman. I read something you'd written last year in 2020, and the transition I'm making is that of incompleted stories, because one of the stories you were part of that did not reach its completion was the administration of Salvador Allende in Chile. And you wrote 50 years ago today, I'll put the implicit ellipses in here. I was dancing along with a multitude of others in the streets of Santiago de Chile, celebrating the election of Allende. It had historical significance beyond Chile. Before then, political revolutions had been violent, et cetera, et cetera. Allende and his coalition used peaceful means. And then you end, I have often fantasized about how different the world would be if Allende had not been overthrown 3 years later in a bloody coup, in which, of course, he died. I wonder where humanity would be if his peaceful revolution had been allowed to run its course and become a template for other countries. So many of us have experienced this sense of loss and incompletion politically, but perhaps none as sharply as the Chilean people in that particular period. Allende too, and that movement, that revolution in general, was cut down before its time. And I think I don't want to speak for you. I think your point is that there too, we all deserve compensation for that loss in a sense.
I think you're absolutely right. For me, it's been certainly, not for me, it's for the people of Chile, but it's also for the people of the world. One of the advantages of being an exile or expatriate, as I am at this moment, I'm far from my countries of origin, let's say, right, is they allow me to see the world as such and to say, well, what does this mean for the world? And for the world, Allende was a very major figure in the history of the 20th century. And the centuries beyond that, that were going to come, the 21st and the 19th century. Because revolutions up till then had been invariably violent. The idea was that you take total power, that you eliminate your adversaries. You have blood on your hands, but it doesn't matter because the blood is compensated by the paradise that will come. Now, that has not worked out the way it should be. And of course, that doesn't mean that one should not believe in revolution and in change. On the contrary, one must think of it more deeply. But in speaking about deeply, I think revolutions need to be deeply democratic, and they must absolutely respect human rights. They are. To portray a revolution as the contrary to human rights is, in fact, to do the work of the enemy. So the reason why Allende is so important in this is because he won the elections by peaceful electoral means and was sabotaged by the ruling class in Chile, by the United States, which had imperial ambitions at that time, right? By the Cold War mentality, and by mistakes inside his own coalition, and the sort of bickering, which in fact we're seeing all over the world again, right? And we're seeing at this now at this moment to vindicate the form of a peaceful revolution, democratic changes, radical changes that are done democratically, that are done with the participation, the deep, the pleno, I was going to say, the full participation of the people is something which is absolutely fundamental, because we find ourselves at a time when there is a resurgence of the worst tendencies in human society, right? We have the autocrats who are coming again, the strong men who are coming for us in different forms and different guises, but it's the same sort of horrible contempt for others and for their rights. And at these moments, it is very important to remember that history does give us a model for what was done right, which is try to change things and do not forget the need for that change. And what was done wrong was, if you end up being so divided against yourself, you will end up, you will allow these other autocrats and these tyrants to take power again. We're at a very, very difficult moment in that sense, right?
We're a very resonant moment, in a very harmonic moment with that moment. And yet, here's what I think a lot of us struggle with, Ariel Dorfman, is I was employee number 5 for Bernie Sanders when he ran for president in 2016. We could have made it. I didn't join the 2020 campaign, but he could have made it. I'm not saying that would have been paradise, but it would have been a considerable improvement. Much, I would argue, I don't know if Bernie thinks this. If he does, he can't admit it, but I would argue somewhat along the Salvador Allende lines, perhaps more moderate, less ambitious, but
well, he's the only candidate who spoke about Allende.
He did.
He's the only one he spoke about Allende, right? He spoke about what had been done in Chile, right?
Yes.
And it's one of the reasons why, of course, I mean, I would have voted even if he hadn't mentioned Allende, but he was also my hero, let's say. He was my candidate, of course.
I will tell you, by the way, as an aside, since Henry Kissinger was so responsible for what happened in Chile, that as Bernie's writer, my proudest moment was when he was debating Hillary Clinton, and Hillary said, when I'm thinking about foreign policy, I talk to my good friends like Henry Kissinger. Right. I don't know who he talks with. And Bernie said, well, it sure ain't going to be Henry Kissinger. I was so filled with love for him at that moment.
Absolutely.
But what I was going to say was, okay, so a lot of people experience the disappointment of Bernie coming so close and not making it. So many Chileans experienced more than that. I mean, they didn't just lose a government. They lost, so many people lost their lives. I was a teenage guitar player and singer, and Victor Jara's death in particular struck me very hard. But so you went through that horror. I guess, in a sense, even the Compensation Bureau touches on this. How do we keep our almost naive sense of optimism that peaceful revolutions of this kind can succeed when they fail? You know what I mean? We all know, if at first you don't succeed, try again and all that, but it gets tough. People burn out. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, of course, I have many thoughts, but none which will save us, let's say, right?
Right.
Going back to our original theme. I would just remind all of us about how history works, and that you do not know what you plant today, how it will grow tomorrow. You just don't know it. The one thing you do know, if you don't plant it today, it won't grow tomorrow.
Right.
So you don't, the only thing you can really make sure of is to do as much as possible today, to be as tolerant as possible, be as open as possible, to be as firm as possible in one's principles, and as flexible as possible as we go forward. But if you do not struggle today, you will leave nothing for the people tomorrow to build on, right? Look, let me just give you an example of the Chilean revolution, right? Every one of the great things that came artistically out of Chile, the murals, the music, you mentioned Victor Jara and the Quilapayún and Inti Illimani, right? My own Donald Duck book, all of them have their roots from before. They didn't appear and bloomed all of a sudden, in the Allende took power and all of a sudden people began to sing, people began to put paintings on the walls, graffiti, or I decided to write about Donald Duck and imperialism. In my own case, I know you were interested in the How to Read Donald Duck book, right? Which is 50 years old this month, right? That had come out of the fact that during 3 or 4 years before that, I had been studying the mass media of fiction of Disney and other people. I was looking at, because I was brought up in the States, I had inside myself the imperial culture, right? And so I looked at my own culture to try to divest myself in some sense of it. I write about this in Heading South, Looking North, one of my memoirs. So the fact is that I had already been preparing. If I had not, I mean, I didn't think when I was studying this in my study or teaching some students, and I have 4 or 5 students, I never thought that this would end up being, a few years later, a book that would appear in dozens of languages, that would change the way in which mass media was watched, that would become a handbook of decolonization, as John Berger called it. I didn't think of that at all. I just thought, this is the task of the moment. I have to do this because it's what needs to be done, right? And at this moment, you're doing this program, right? And this program, we don't know what this program will create. We don't know what person is watching us today who 30 years from now can be the next Bernie Sanders. We don't know this.
Right.
We do know that there will be no Bernie Sanders, a new Bernie Sanders or a new Richard, a new Ariel, if we don't do this work that we're doing, right? I mean, it's the small work. And it's not the only, that's why I began with the idea of heroes. I mean, I think I've done an enormous amount of stuff, but it's nothing compared to what people do every day. I can remember one anecdote, which is I was with Coetzee in South Africa a long time ago, right?
The author, J.M. Coetzee. Yeah.
The J.M. Coetzee, the Nobel Prize winner. Yeah. And we were speaking about Michael Kay, and we were speaking about Waiting for Barbarians. And our host, the Chilean ambassador at that point, was asking him, well, how does it feel to be so important? And he said, I'm not important. The woman who gets up every day at 3:00 in the morning to become a nurse and take care of the bedpans of sick people, now that person is important. Now, right. So we need to understand the bedpans are being taken out, right? The Compensation Bureau, in some sense, is a homage to those people, right? Because the woman that the actuary falls in love with, in fact, is trying to save a forest and is tortured and killed because of that. But her response to this is not hatred. Her response to us is, remember the rain in the garden, which is a Sufi thing, right? It comes out of Rumi. Remember the rain in the garden. In other words, when I become earth, I will become a vegetable. I will come out of that. We will in some way resurrect in others who remember us, who go on, right? So that's my only advice. My only advice is do what you need to do now as far as you can. And don't feel guilty if you don't do more. Feel the urge to do more, but don't, because guilt is not a very good counselor. Anger is not a very good counselor. Love is a great counselor in that sense, right? But we must be wary of love as well, right? Because it has its own traps, right?
Yeah. Inspiration is great. This is why I always encourage people who are political not to do politics on the internet, but to do it face to face. Well, obviously now we have COVID, but to do it in contact with other human beings, because that human connection is so important to maintaining to maintaining the enthusiasm.
Even those who we consider our adversaries or enemies, if we can find some common ground with them, this happens. And from there, we can build things. I'm not in the mood of saying, we should agree with the Republicans on this or that. I think there are some really bad people over there. But I would look, all the time they speak to me, they say, but these people aren't human. And I say, unfortunately, they are human.
Right.
It's like Death in the Maiden, right? The problem with the person who tortured Paulina, who is the protagonist of this, is not that he's inhuman or unhuman or non-human. The problem is that he listens to Schubert, he loves Schubert, he quotes Nietzsche, he has kind gestures. And the point about this is that this is a man who is all too human. If the person were inhuman, it would be very easy. You just eradicate them, right? Which is why violent revolutions are not my favorite. Because then all you do is say, the way we get rid of the problem is we get rid of the bad people on the other side, right? But it turns out that, first of all, they have all the power. They've got the military. They've got the atom bomb. They've got the torture sessions, right? So they're the ones who are going to eliminate us. So that's just from the point of view of strategy, right? But from the point of view of humanity, we do not want our hands bloody with We don't want to carry that burden. We're better than that. And when we are better than that, we make changes. Because, let's not forget, there was a time when there was child slavery everywhere, when there was slavery everywhere, when women couldn't vote, right? There's so many things we've done right. And climate change, there was a time of total denialism, right? Look now where we are. So that has come out of small people doing small things and large people doing as much as they possibly can.
And I know you're limited for time, so
I am.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. I will say, though, that I think that getting in the habit of denying the humanity of others is the road to destruction for everyone. But again,
the road to perdition, yes,
please go ahead.
No, it's the road to perdition. It is. And yes. I use those terms theologically then.
Yes. All right. Very good. And again, it's been a great pleasure. Ariel Dorfman.
The pleasure's been mine.
The book is The Compensation Bureau. Thank you so much for joining us. And I'll repeat it again. A great pleasure.
You know something, Richard? I promised to come back in March, April. I have a book of poems coming out called Voices from the Other Side of Death. I promise to come back and we will talk about that then, okay?
I look forward to that very much.
I enjoy this enormously. I'm just sorry that so many things, especially the elections now in Chile, where we are facing a crypto proto-fascist, and this has just devoured my time, and I must dedicate some time to that. In other words, I've got to dedicate time to doing what I said I need to do, right? So
right, walking the walk, as they say.
Right. So, take care. Be well.
You too.
Hugs to you.
And you. And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.